Welcome. I am a lay Shin Buddhist who nevertheless maintains an interest in the broader realm of Pure Land and Mahayana Buddhist teachings. My YouTube channel is called Akala Akala, that is A-C-A-L-A, A-C-A-L-A. In these podcasts, I make a non-scholarly, humble, and sometimes bumbling attempt to explore a particular topic or question related to the wonderful Buddha Dharma. I hope you find them to be of interest. With that said, let us begin. In my last podcast, I think I made reference to the idea that Amitas Primal Vow is really oriented toward saving those who actually do have severe limitations with respect to their ability to perform good acts. Actually, it even goes further than that to say that it's primarily geared toward evil persons who have committed terrible acts. This is very sort of paradoxical and contradictory in some sense from how we usually think about spiritual matters. Usually we think in terms of the fact that, well, it's the good person that's going to be saved. They're the ones that are going to, so to speak, go to heaven or be reborn in the Pure Land. But again, this was not Shinran's understanding of the nature of Pure Land Buddhism. And there's no place where he is said to have stated it in more explicit terms than in the first chapter, just 3 simple paragraphs within the volume called Tanisho. And I say was said to have said it because the Tanisho was not actually written by Shinran. It was written by supposedly one of his disciples called Yenbo. And it's a much revered volume for very understandable reasons, because in this book, Yenbo, he states what he understood Shinran to have said in providing his teaching of Shin Buddhism, and he states it in very clear, explicit, understandable terms, almost to the point where it kind of shocks us with its explicitness in terms of what really was Shinran teaching. So let's take a look at that first chapter, if you will. Again, simple 3 paragraphs is all. And as we work it through, we will see through this simple 3 paragraphs the essence of Shinran's system of pure grace in terms of his interpretation of Pure Land Buddhism. So again, this is what Yenbo said that Shinran said. Saved by the inconceivable working of Amitas vow, I shall realize birth into the Pure Land. The moment you entrust yourself thus, so that the mind set upon saying the name arises within you, you are brought to share in the benefit of being grasped by Amita, never to be abandoned. So that first sentence is what we say to ourselves when we experience that shinjin or sense of entrusting in the vow. We say to ourselves, saved by the inconceivable working of Amita's vow, I shall realize birth into the Pure Land. Again, this word inconceivable that I've referenced in a couple of previous podcasts, we can't understand how this vow works. It's impossible for our mind to get around this notion of the power of this other power that pulls us along and nullifies our negative karma in order to give us this opportunity, this gift of rebirth in the Pure Land. So again, we say to ourselves, saved by the inconceivable working of Amita's vow, I shall realize birth into the Pure Land. And in the next phrase where Shinran says, the moment you entrust yourself thus, he hits on that key dynamic of entrusting. Entrusting is the key dynamic. You know, we can talk about saying the name, we can talk about having faith, but if we want to understand the actual function of what is going on in the context of Shinjin, it's entrusting. We are entrusting in the power of that primal vow. So Shinran says, the moment you entrust yourself thus, in other words, in the way that earlier phrase articulates, so that he says, the mind set upon saying the name arises within you, you are brought to share in the benefit of being grasped by Amita, never to be abandoned. So when we experience that shinjin or entrusting, then the the mind set upon saying the name arises. In other words, the phrase Namu Amida Butsu, or frankly some like phrase, if you will, it arises not again as a petitionary prayer or as a sort of request for some kind of salvation, because at that point our salvation is already assured. So the name arising within us is really, according to Shin Buddhism, and I take this to be very valid in terms of a spiritual truth, that saying the name Namu Amida Butsu is really merely an expression of gratitude. It's an expression of gratitude for what has already been given. Namely, what has been given? What has been given is that we are brought to share in the benefit of being grasped by Amida, never to be abandoned. Now, the second paragraph. Know that the primal vow of Amida makes no distinction between people young and old, good and evil. Only the entrusting of yourself to it is essential, for it was made to save the person in whose karmic evil is deep-rooted and whose blind passions abound. So here we have an incredible kind of egalitarianism, that the vow of Amida makes no distinction between people young and old or good and evil. In other words, the good person does not have a leg up as far as accomplishing this experience of being grasped by Amida. Only the entrusting of yourself to it is essential, says Shinran. And then he goes further. It's amazing. He says, for it, the vow, was made to save the person in whose karmic evil is deep-rooted and whose blind passions abound. So we've seen in Reverend Suji's profession of faith how when we really look at ourselves honestly, we see that we all have a number of blind passions that we frankly don't want to admit to, but they're there. Now, that said, most of us wouldn't judge ourselves necessarily to be evil per se, and yet that's the word that's used here by Yenbo when he's describing Shinran's teaching. Evil that is deep-rooted, actual evil, that's who the vow was made for. Shinran says, according to Yenbo, he says, thus, entrusting yourself to the primal vow requires no performance of good, for no act can hold greater virtue than saying the name. In other words, within Shin Buddhism, in order to benefit from Amida's grace, from the extending of his other power to us, there's no requirement that we perform any particular good, no requirement that we have any particular knowledge of the Dharma, no requirement that we have any particular sort of level of devotional ritual or spiritual kinds of activities in association with any kind of a belief system. And what he's saying is that no act can hold greater virtue than saying the name, because I think in the explanation within Shin Buddhist scholars that the idea is, and within Shinran's Kaiogao Shinsho, I think the idea is that Amida endows all that virtue in the name. That's why when we look at a Shin Buddhist altar, what do we see at the front of the altar? Typically we see the name, Namu Amida Butsu, typically in 6 Chinese characters, because that is, in a sense, actually what that is in some people's opinions, which I really like, is that it's a manifestation of the Dharmakaya, the law body, the truth body, the ultimate Buddha body is embodied in those 6 characters, in that phrase, Namu Amida Butsu. Now, the last sentence in this paragraph, where Shinran supposedly says, nor is there any need to despair of the evil you commit, for no act is so evil that it obstructs the working of Amitas Primal Vow. Now, that's very powerful, but it's also very important to give this caveat that Shinran himself states, and also that's stated in a later part of this Tanisho, is that that's not a license to commit evil. In other words, if a person commits evil as a function of their karmic circumstances. In other words, causes and conditions. They're past various causes that have led to who they are right at that moment in time. That's one thing. But if a person says to themselves, oh, this is cool, Amitas Primal Vow, it absolves me of any evil, so I can go out and do this, that, and the other that's evil. No, that's not what it means. And actually, later, Shinran articulates that particular point by saying, just because there's an anecdote doesn't mean that you take a poison. So that's an important point that mitigates against the potential criticism of Shin Buddhism that it can lead to what's referred to as antinomianism. But that said, think of how powerful this system is, that it's actually made for persons who are the most passion-ridden and ignorant and even evil, and that it, namely the primal vow, as it's described within the larger Pure Land or Sukhavati Sutra, has this power to save even that person, which, if we really look at it, we, frankly, can identify ourselves with that person. For each one of us, even though we may not have committed so-called evil acts, we are all sort of characterized by a certain blind passion and ignorance that is part of the nature of our human experience, which is extraordinarily hard to overcome through our own willpower and self-effort. Thus, we rely upon the primal vow of Amida Buddha. Namo Amida Butsu. With that, I will sign off by reciting the Nembutsu in gratitude for being embraced and accepted just as I am by Amida Buddha, never, never to be abandoned. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu.